It's my pleasure to introduce Agnes Bihari. Agnes is an international business development expert and she works with the LUMSA University. She's joining us from Costa Rica and her presentation title is Sustainable Development Diplomacy, SDD, the Paramount of Current International Affairs. Agnes Bihari is a trailblazing international consultant and multilingual leader driving global sustainable corporate governance, ESG for short, at multiple multinational companies and intercultural diplomacy. Her focus area includes public-private partnerships, PPP, related to SDG 17, partnerships to achieve the goals, and SDG 16, strong institutions, through regulatory risk and compliance to uphold institutional reputation. In relation to SDG 4, quality education, Agnes has acted as a tutor of the European Union's InvestMed project, promoting sustained investment and entrepreneurial capacity building for women and youth on behalf of LUMSA University. Agnes is specialized in biology, environmental management, and educational sciences. She also holds a master's degree in management of the Sustainable Development Goals and a postgraduate specialization in executive diplomatic leadership. She has 28 years experience in international events management related to corporate, scientific, and sustainable development conferences in Europe, Middle East and Africa, the Americas, and Asia Pacific. Please welcome Agnes.
Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much, Josephine, for the wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Patricia, for this invitation. I am delighted to be here. And Professor Giovanni, I really appreciate your continued leadership and your wonderful presentation. So thank you so much. I would like Ricky, please, to go ahead and share my screen. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about sustainable development diplomacy. And since the different sustainable development goals will be touched upon several times throughout this conference, I'm not going to go into details about it. Rather, what I like to do is invite you to take a different approach to think about everything that we have learned so far about sustainability, about therefore I'm going to just draw your attention to recent headlines that we have seen in the different parts of the media. Next, please. So I will talk about the definitions, some reminders, as I mentioned, about the media, recommendations and conclusions. Next, please. Okay, so this is the way we understand diplomacy and international affairs. Next. Sustainability is something that we normally use for the environment. Next, please. Next, please. So here I'm going to talk to you about some sustainable development goals and overall information that we have currently. We have about a 30-year throwback regarding poverty, all the advancements that have been made so far, unfortunately, due to COVID, Russia's sanctions, and food insecurity and energy crisis, we have been going backwards. Next. So as you can see, I'm going to mention a few types of diplomacy that we have seen also in some of the headlines, social media, or on television. For example, here you can see demonstrators in London talking about affordable energy and the energy crisis that is inducing current situations that are getting close to the poverty level. Next, please. Rising food crises have made the headlines, for example, with the Sri Lanka, Dutch farmers have also striked and they gained European support as well as global support. Next. So here you can see an example of citizen diplomacy across Europe, where everyone, different people from different walks of life also joined this movement. Next, please. The effects of COVID and climate crisis have made a negative impact on increasing mental and physical health crises across youth and adults. Next. You can see an example of science diplomacy where different countries cooperated, and we have seen some of the results that have been highly debated about the origins and the purpose of the virus. Next, please. We can also see a lot of examples of NGO diplomacy, whereby people belonging to different civic movements also have a say, and they also make headlines and they draw attention to those they want to talk about. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of young people are currently, unfortunately, impacted by the negative outlook of the future, and they are making their voices heard many times as well. Next, please. There are shifting priorities regarding quality education that have also made headlines regarding many controversies. Next, please. Here you can see an example of cultural diplomacy where the United States Embassy is sponsoring performances in Ecuador. Next, please. Now, regarding gender equality, we also have had some new changes regarding the definition of genders or definition of women, which have also sparked a lot of controversies regarding fair competition in sports, scholarships, and legal matters. Next, please. Okay, here we can talk about sports diplomacy, where Qatar has also been under the spotlight and talking about good and not so good or negative images regarding how the country manages human rights or other topics. Whereby the organizers requested everybody to respect the local traditions and how, you know, the country is managing their own internal affairs. Next, please. We have the water crisis regarding pollution, climate change, and droughts. Next, please. We can talk about humanitarian or hydro diplomacy. Next. The European Green Deal, as it was mentioned by Professor Ferry, is something that we have advanced towards. However, unfortunately, during the past Russia sanctions, all Europeans and other parts of the world as well have been negatively impacted by the rising energy prices. Next, please. So here there was, for example, a big debate between Germany and France regarding whether nuclear energy can be called clean energy or sustainable energy or not. Next, please. Global uncertainty also has impacted decent work and economic growth, SDG number 8. As you have seen, there have been a lot of layoffs, and we are heading toward a global recession. Next. So here we can also talk about another type of diplomacy that is called financial aid. Next. Regarding the new norm or post-COVID situation, we have seen a new surge regarding digital transformation and abilities. However, there are some negative effects as well, because not everyone has access to internet, for example. So there is a big gap that is widening between rural areas or poor areas and more developed areas, as well as many times we are required to do something. For example, electric cars are being promoted, but there is no necessary infrastructure to plug them, or there is no enough electricity to charge them. Next, please. Okay, here you can see earthquake diplomacy, as we have recently seen in Syria and Turkey. It has called, you know, for a international collaboration regarding helping out these impacted countries. Next, please. Reduce inequalities. There has been criticism for due to double standards and how different humanitarian crises are viewed differently, or maybe give a different percentage of media coverage. Next, please. For example, here you can see an example of citizen diplomacy, whereby it was expressed that we need to pay attention to all the humanitarian crises all over the world and help everyone equally. Next, please. There is also a climate lockdown controversy, whereby the so-called 15 minutes sustainable cities are viewed with doubts by the common citizens. Next, please. So as you can see, for example, there were protesters in February regarding that initiative in Oxford. That's called citizen diplomacy. Next, please. Regarding waste and lack of natural resources, we have seen a positive tendency regarding people slowing down, not to use so many resources, or not to upgrade their phones rather than fixing things. So there is a positive side for that. Next one. We can also talk about fashion diplomacy with regards to fast fashion. And also fashion diplomacy is something that is mostly portrayed by first ladies. Next, please. When we talk about celebrity diplomacy, there is an example by a person who also recommended or her donation of her income to the right causes. Next, please. Unfortunately, we have seen a bit of regression on the green transition, as it was mentioned earlier, due to the Russia sanctions. We have not been able to continuously using the gas that is not so polluting. So we have turned in many countries burning coal and wood to keep warm during the winter. Next, please. Okay, so in a coercive diplomacy is one example whereby when it was requested for the countries to in Saudi Arabia and other countries to increase oil production, and it was not granted, then the coercive diplomacy examples is that it was mentioned that there would be consequences. Next, please. An example of NGO diplomacy regarding clean and affordable energy. So climate activists have been making headlines regarding different actions. Next, please. Here we can see also an example whereby activists impeded fire brigades to do their job, and they were putting at risk some other citizens because of their actions. Next, please. There is a collateral damage, unfortunately, as you can see on the next slide. Next, please. So it was a huge problem for the local wildlife. Next, please. We can also talk about biodiversity loss. Next. I am currently in Costa Rica in the Osa Peninsula, where this is one of the most biologically intense places on Earth. So this is a positive example of diplomacy that is called country branding. Next, please. There is an increased public scrutiny whereby governments are held accountable. Next. So here we can see foreign aid diplomacy. Next. Public-private partnerships combine different forms of diplomacy. Next. We can also talk about celebrity diplomacy with Sean Penn handing over the Oscar for safekeeping. Next. Okay, so let's talk about the recommendations. Next. Personal brand is something very important for professionals in protocol and diplomacy, because people who are representing their countries are in the public eye. Next. So here we can see another example of celebrity diplomacy. Next. And goodwill diplomacy. Next. It's important for us to be legally compliant because secrets do not remain secrets forever. Next. You can see a lot of scandals have come to light. Next. So it's important to be financially transparent. We need to look after our personal brand. Next. And also there have been new terms coined regarding gates. So regarding the non-observance of COVID rules, we had the Partygate, the EU Parliament bribery, we had the Qatar Gate, and classified document mishandling has been called the Garage Gate, making headlines. Next, please. Here you can see a protocol situation whereby the Queen had to sit on her own because of the COVID. And at the meantime, at the same time, there were parties held in the Prime Minister's office. So that became a huge scandal. Next, please. Next. Next. Okay, and next, please. So as you can see, public opinion has a very, very big power, and we need to be very careful about the image that we are presenting. Next, please. So I'm going to get to my conclusions, and very briefly, I'm going to conclude the presentation. Next, please. So sustainable development, as we saw, is not only about the environment. We have to take into account other measures as well, such as social part and the economic part. Next, please. Diplomacy as well is not only about the high-level protocol, it's also about citizenship participation. Next, please. And international affairs, as well as I mentioned, it takes elements from the new diplomacy. That means citizenship participation. Next, please. So when we look at different organizations or private people or public figures, there are some red flags that we can look out to. First of all, mission drift. Do they do what they stand for, their values? And also, do they do greenwash, or do they really do something for the environment? Next, please. A framework that helps us to evaluate different companies or organizations is the ESG framework, Environmental, Social, and Corporate Governance. As you can see, some of the key elements have been included here, and these are some scorecards that are created for the companies, for the institutions, whereby potential investors who want to invest in the so-called responsible or sustainable investment, they can also help to further their cause. Next, please. So according to systems thinking, we cannot separate the sustainable development goals. They need to be taken into account as a whole in terms of how they interact. And some of them interact on various levels. Next, please. Okay, so these are some essential values that I also embrace. One of them is integrity, whereby we approach people aiming for a win-win outcome. Insight is to understand people's realities, aim to restore their dignity and impact to achieve a sustainable socio-economic improvement through co-creation. Next. I invite you to connect on LinkedIn, and I remain at your disposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Agnes, for that diverse presentation there. I am amazed at the different types of diplomacy that we have, you know, in terms of citizen diplomacy, NGO diplomacy, you know, different types, coercive diplomacy, celebrity diplomacy. That is very massive. And what really, usually when we talk about SDGs, like you said, everybody thinks about climate change and how climate affects our lives and all that, but we don't actually think in terms of these things, you know, how people diplomacy, celebrity diplomacy can impact, or maybe NGO diplomacy even can impact what we do overall. And I'm a bit intrigued about the ESG, because I know that that's been what has actually failed a lot of countries down south, like a lot of African countries. The environmental, social, and governance impact is what has really affected a lot of them. So I'm just thinking, I just wanted to ask, how can we use goodwill diplomacy, right, to help areas such as, you know, where the Ukraine situation, or the Turkey situation, Syria situation? How, I mean, I've been thinking about that, and what you've been talking about. How can goodwill diplomacy impact things like that? That's a little question for you, Agnes.
Yes, it's an excellent question, because as you can see, information is power. And we have become society whereby we pay a lot of attention to people that we admire, that we follow. And this is regarding the digital diplomacy that you are also dealing with, you know, how fast information travels. And this is a key situation to gain the support of key, let's say, influencers or goodwill ambassadors, you know, to help them further a cause. This is really, really important, because they are a kind of messenger between potentially countries and people at large. So how it can be achieved, I think, as I mentioned, one of the core values is, first of all, integrity. We need to examine these influencers or these public figures that you would like to gain for your cause, and examine them, what they stand for. Do you align with their values? Do they act? Do they walk the talk? Do they act the way that they speak? The second is I would invite them to come to my country for them to see for themselves what the local situation is, for them to know the local realities, because only then can they be true ambassadors to truthfully represent our country and to further our cause. And finally, impact is when they understand the local situation, they understand our realities, what we would like to do, then they are really able to make an impact in their communication and in helping our cause, our country, our community to gain a track and to gain supporters through co-creation. There are equal partners. No one is above or below the others. This is key. So I think
Thank
this
you
is the way
so much. Thanks so much for that.